I used to make money by selling things on Craigslist. What I did was buy cheap items from garage sales, thrift shops, or even auction houses, then sell them on Craigslist for a higher price. Sometimes I even bought stuff from other sellers on Craigslist just to resell it for a higher price. All I had to do was change the title and description to include keywords that'll appeal to the algorithm, or just use my seniority as a seller on the site to make sure that my more expensive offer shows up before the original sellers in the search results. A bit of a dirty trick, I know. But hey, as long as it works, I'm not complaining. It's not like I make a lot of money out of it anyways. I could live comfortably enough with it as my sole source of income, but I wasn't going to be rolling in dough because of it anytime soon. Every now and again, I'd have a good month when I'm able to score big, because I managed to sell an antique that the person I bought it from didn't know the value of. However, most of the time I barely make any more money than I would have just flipping burgers at McDonald's. Buying and selling stuff online was a hell of a lot less stressful than working in customer service though there was one experience that almost made me give it all up. I was attending an auction to clear out the belongings of some dead rich fellow. The man didn't have any surviving children and as far as I knew, had no friends who were still alive. So his belongings were being auctioned off one by one at an event. The stuff being sold at these sort of events were usually pretty worthless, but occasionally I got lucky and nabbed something valuable like a painting by an obscure artist with a cult following willing to pay good money for it. No such item was being sold that day. Well, not one that I recognized anyways. I was just about to give up and resign myself to going home empty-handed when the auctioneer brought something interesting onto the stage. A staff member put a large doll on the stage table. It looked to be of a young girl no older than 5, and was roughly the same size a child that age would be. With my experience as an appraiser, I was able to recognize the clothing it wore to be a style that was popular in the 1920s, but the doll itself wasn't made of shiny porcelain like you'd see on most dolls from that era. Instead, its skin looked soft to the touch and almost human-like. If it wasn't for the clothing, I would have thought it was made of modern silicone. In stark contrast to its rosy pink skin that seemed like it could hide living veins, its large blue eyes were dead and glassy, staring at everything and seeing nothing. The auctioneer insisted that it had been in the old man's possession for years. He apparently made it from scratch himself for his young daughter in the 1920s, shortly before she passed away in the influenza pandemic. It was an unusual piece to be sure. A weird doll enthusiast would probably love to have it in their collection. Plus, it was a general rule in antique dealing that if an item is over 100 years old and you can still make out what it is, someone, somewhere will be willing to pay good money for it. While it was creepy as all hell, I didn't want my trip to have been for nothing. I decided to put in a bid for $50, fully expecting someone to outbid me, and yet, nobody did. My best guess is they must have thought the doll looked just as creepy as I did, but I was never one to allow personal feelings on items to get in the way of making money. That antique doll was the only thing I managed to snag from that auction. Upon actually touching it with my own hands, I was struck by the pliability of whatever it was made of. The doll's skin seemed to contort to the shape of my hand when I held it like soft skin. I would have liked to examine its body more thoroughly to see if it had a maker's signature or manufacture date printed somewhere. But upon closer inspection, I found its clothes were directly sewn onto its soft skin, and not wanting to accidentally damage anything, I left it be. Despite the clear age of the doll and its clothes, they were remarkably well maintained. I could tell by the meticulous care it must have been given over the years that the doll must have meant a lot to the previous owner. It was a little sad to think that such a treasured belonging was about to be sold off to some stranger on a website famous for shady deals. But I quickly got over it. A man's gotta eat after all. When I got home, I advertised the doll for $150 on Craigslist to net myself $100 profit. I also gave it a title that was something along the lines of antique 1920s doll. Good condition, white dress, curly brown hair, blue eyes, in full caps. I went to bed immediately after making the post. The auction house had been a long way from my apartment past hellish traffic, so I was just about ready to pass out on my bed at that point. Plus, I didn't think anyone would be too eager to buy the doll anyways. I certainly didn't expect to wake up the next day to find an urgent message on my Craigslist account offering to buy the doll for triple the listed price. A $400 profit was nothing to sneeze at, but I was suspicious when they asked for my address so they could come pick it up themselves. Despite this, I accepted the offer. I didn't quite understand the reason at the time. I'd never had to deal with a request like that before, so I was a bit skeptical. Still, I lived in a pretty well-populated apartment and knew my neighbors well. I was sure they'd come to help me if the buyer started causing trouble. Not an hour after I gave them the address, my buyer, a young woman with curly brown hair, showed up at my front door. She wasn't alone either. She stood behind an old woman in a wheelchair, whom she shared a resemblance to, most likely her grandmother, and had two policemen wearing medical masks and white latex gloves flanking them on either side. I was confused as to why the cops were there, but I invited them in anyways to avoid looking suspicious. Upon seeing the doll, the old woman immediately burst into tears and had to be comforted by her granddaughter. I quickly apologized for whatever I might have done to upset her, but she just kept muttering the same phrase over and over again. "It's her. It's her. It's her." While I was trying to figure out what was going on, the policeman carefully bagged the doll in a plastic Ziploc bag to make a call while the other approached me with an explanation that made my stomach churn. The crying old woman was the ex-wife of the man who owned the doll before me. They divorced shortly after their daughter died to the influenza pandemic on bitter terms, and she wasn't even allowed to attend her funeral or see her body before it was buried. Turns out, the burial never occurred. The old man had been a famous toy maker who made his fortune making artisan dolls. He made every single toy his daughter ever had himself, and when she died, he refused to let her go. I'd bought the corpse of that little girl, carefully crafted into a doll by a father who just couldn't live without her. I really wanted a PlayStation 4 when it first came out. Unfortunately, I was a broke high school student who was barely able to scrape by with straight C's with neither the time nor necessary skills for a part-time job. Graphics weren't all that important to me, but I wanted to play all the console exclusives that were on it. Every new trailer for a PS4 console exclusive sent me crawling back to my hand-me-down PC filled with Steam games bought on massive discount. I've always been the frugal sort anyways, so despite my yearning, I was hesitant to buy a PS4, even then because of its high retail price. My family wasn't poor, but there were times in my childhood when our middle-class status were challenged because of changing markets. Early on, I was taught to have a good amount of money saved up in my bank account at all times. Better to have the money and not need it than need it and not have it, you know. That frugalness stuck with me all the way until I was in university studying music. I'd become a little more open to splurging than I was in my high school days by then because of my part-time job. That, and I couldn't exactly be stingy when it came to buying and maintaining the musical instruments I needed for class. I still tried to save money whenever possible, though. I always looked far and wide for the best deal before buying anything big. It often didn't matter if the item was secondhand or not, as long as it worked properly. When the PlayStation 5 came out and people started selling their PS4s for almost half the market price, I jumped on the chance to buy the console I'd coveted for so long. As usual, I scoured through the internet in secondhand electronic shops all across my town for discarded PS4s. To the surprise of absolutely no one, I found the cheapest option on Craigslist. It was half the price of what everyone else was offering, which probably should have been a red flag, but I was willing to try my luck. The address the seller gave to pick up the console was in a safe neighborhood too, so it wasn't like I was going anywhere dangerous. When I met the guy selling the PS4, he seemed pretty normal save for a few eccentricities. He spoke at 100 words per minute, and his tiny studio apartment was full of used electronics haphazardly strewn about. I tried to keep quiet at first, but my curiosity won out in the end, and I asked him what was up with all of it. He chuckled and told me he was an electronic engineering major, and liked to take apart old electronics in his spare time for practical experience. A little odd, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I'm sure some of the shit we music majors do must seem pretty strange to everyone else too. I gave the guy his money, took the scratched up PS4, and went back to my apartment a happy man. After I set the console up, I spent the rest of the evening playing all the games I managed to score from the local GameStop bargain bin. Once the initial glow of getting a new console wore off and I had to actually concentrate on the games I played, I started hearing something odd. As I said, I was a music major, so I was used to having to pick out tones and individual sounds when listening to songs during editing. Gauging the pitch of random sounds and picking out stuff from the background had practically become second nature to me at that point. Hidden amidst the sound of the internal mechanism whirring inside the PS4 were ticking sounds that I almost missed. Although it was barely noticeable when on the PlayStation homepage, and nigh imperceptible with the sound of gameplay drowning it out, I couldn't unhear it after I'd noticed it. Eventually it got so grating to my ears that I couldn't even enjoy the games I was playing anymore. I couldn't just bring it back to the seller though. It still worked as intended, and I probably should have expected as much from a secondhand console from a guy who probably dismantled it at some point. So instead I found a local gaming store and had them take a look at it after explaining my problems with it. The next day I woke up to the sound of a SWAT team bursting in through my apartment door. They cuffed me while I was still on the bed and escorted me out of my home before I could fully process the whole thing. Later on, once things had calmed down, I was escorted to an interrogation room and given the whole story. A bomb had been planted in that PlayStation that went off earlier that morning while a staff member was dismantling it, injuring 3 people. Going through customer records led the police to me. I quickly told them the truth, that I'd got it on Craigslist for cheap, and even let them know the address of the guy I bought it from. A few days later I was released, and the university was informed of the misunderstanding. Last I heard, the guy I bought the PS4 from was arrested and sent to prison. Apparently, he wanted to show the world the evil of modern luxury by selling electronics implanted with bombs to unwitting people. A total of 5 such items were found in the possession of other buyers like me, and defused in time. All of them had been advertised on Craigslist for the same low price. I no longer do my shopping on Craigslist, or any other secondhand store for that matter. If you like these scary stories, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Either way, you won't be escaping from the fear zone.